Started. This is, I think, session 7 of our classic metal class that we hold monthly. And sometimes we talk specifically about philosophical issues. Like last time, we were focusing on the ethical issue raised by whether bands can do more than one farewell tour. The answer is pretty much no, if you want to be ethical. But a lot of times we focus on music history. And so, we've done shows on like the Black Sabbath, the Purple Nexus, early metal. 2 sessions ago, we did a thing on British metal in the late 70s. And so the natural jumping off point for that is this massively influential movement that we call the new wave of British heavy metal. And we're going to do a lot of music history stuff, and Scott's going to talk a lot about, how sonic profiles are changing and the technology and all of that. And we also have a few things to hash out back and forth that we've been discussing, like how influential was punk, what to make of Def Leppard as new wave of British heavy metal. So we're going to bring those things in. But I do want to say that I think that there is a philosophical issue involved right off the bat, which is how we define things, how we characterize things, because when it was happening, there was something that could be identified as a new wave of British heavy metal, right? But a lot of the people involved in it subsequently have said, well, I'm not really sure that there was an integral sort of essential one-size-fits-all definition for this. Maybe it was more of a loose movement. And at the same time, we can contrast it with some of the genres that came out. We can say, for example, that the prevalence of glam metal in the mid-1980s did something to dampen the new wave of British heavy metal scene, except for those that were glam, like Wrathchild. So I think there are some philosophical issues there, and they have to do with some of the things we've talked about before. How do you define? Where do you draw the borders? How do you characterize things effectively? And it's really tough to do with musical movements, we're finding out, Scott and I, as we hash these things out. And I think all of you are kind of involved in that as well, in figuring those things out. So before we get started, let me throw the ball over to Scott and ask him, do you think there really is like a core to new wave of British heavy metal, or is it really more of a sociological thing that we can say music history, it kind of fits in, but there's no actual essence to it?
Well, I think the era we're talking about, which I think we agree is like 80 to 83, right?
Yeah.
So a few things that I've addressed before, but probably the last session, we have to remember at 1983, rock and roll was only about 16 years old. And let me clarify that. Of course, we argue, when did rock and roll start? I get it with the blues and, Elvis and everything, but everybody that's the metal guitarist will say Ed Sullivan, February 9th, 1964, the Beatles. And that's the first time everybody said, we want to form bands. Even Joe Walsh, Steve Lukather, ask any guitarist and they'll say, that's where rock and roll started for us. So we have to remember that if we follow the history just a little bit, I won't go too much into it, but 64, and then by the late 60s, we've got Jimi Hendrix doing his thing. We've got Deep Purple starting out. We have Led Zeppelin. So already 5 years into the birth of rock bands starts doing that. So 1980s, not so far out. So I think we can kind of, say what the new movements are. So Deep Purple lasted through the era, and we're going to talk about the bands that we're going to consider to be the new wave of metal, and you'll talk about that. So I mean, that's kind of the history of it. So it makes sense, like 1980s happening, everything's new and exciting. They're still pushing the boundaries, but then maybe we'll talk later. But something I talked to Greg about before is a lot of this has to do with technology evolving and production trends. So I think that's some of the stuff we're going to get to, right? Is kind of
Yeah,
like,
absolutely. And we're going to find ways to make that not sound abstract and boring.
no, I'll be very
Yeah,
specific actually.
yeah.
I'll be very specific. But yeah, right now I'm trying to give like an overview. If that, did that answer the question or?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when some of the people who were involved in it, like I was just reading an interview today with Algie Ward from Tank, which is really a very important new wave of British heavy metal band. And they were interviewing not just him, but also some of the other people who were involved in the first generation of that band, the Brad brothers. And they were all like, yeah, this new wave of British heavy metal thing, we weren't really that into that. So you have a band that's considered central to it after the fact saying, we didn't really like the other new wave of British heavy metal bands. We were more into ZZ Top and stuff like that. You know? Go ahead.
If I can interject, you know, this is a great thing because you and I, that we were talking about Blue Oyster Cult.
Yeah.
And one of the members of Blue Oyster Cult saying, no, we're not heavy metal. I don't even like that stuff that much. And, you know, that being kind of like, what did you say? You had this great comparison about
with
Camus.
Albert Camus and existentialism. Yeah, he frames himself as not being an existentialist by relation to the other existentialists, but he also ends up really fitting into the movement because it's the same common themes, right? So in music terms, I guess we could say there's a common musicality to it. There's a common origin or background that they're coming out of. I mean, I've never really thought this out, but you could think of metal songs as ways of producing solutions to particular problems, you know, or challenges. Can you make a song about rainbows and make it make some sense? Sure, Rainbow in the Dark. You know? Can you come up with something good for this riff? And I guess you could say that bands kind of have those sorts of things in common with each other. So going back to this, yeah, it may be that new wave of British heavy metal is really, there is a common set of sounds, not one single sound, and they're being pushed forward during the era so that there's some changes taking place. Like Iron Maiden in Number of the Beast is really, it's not a different band, but it's a different sound from Iron Maiden or even Killers, or even Made in Japan, that concert album in between those two. So it's kind of a moving target. They are influencing each other. They're part of a scene. The older bands haven't entirely exited, except for, say, Deep Purple, right? But even Deep Purple is still around in Gillan, in Rainbow, you know, in the spin-off bands, you could say. I guess you could say Whitesnake is also a spin-off band since Coverdale is in Deep Purple. Let's look at what Mark is saying here. My hot take. The three most influential bands in heavy metal are the Beatles, Kiss, and Venom. Maybe add Van Halen. I guess by extension, this implies Venom is the most definitive new wave of British heavy metal band. I wouldn't go along with that. I would say that they are important in terms of like inspiring black metal, and so they're massively influential in that respect. But the most influential heavy metal band in the new wave of British heavy metal in terms of who influenced other bands, Iron Maiden, hands down, you know. And I think you could say Def Leppard sort of after that, although they almost like worked themselves out of being new wave of British heavy metal. They're viewed as more of an American band, and they'd actually get like bottles thrown at them when they were in England for a while because they were viewed as being too American sounding and having sold out, right? Kiss, yeah, you know, Kiss. When you look at, so this is we'll come back to some of the stuff we're going to talk about, but let's talk about influences. When you look at who the people in the new wave of British heavy metal list as influences, some of it is contemporary bands. Like some of them will say that they were influenced by Judas Priest or Motorhead. Tank did a lot of, you know, sort of, we're not a Motorhead clone because they were getting accused of it. I don't see a lot of them citing Kiss. I think Kiss is really influential on American metal. I don't know it's that influential on the new wave of British heavy metal. Deep Purple's brought up, Black Sabbath, Budgie. Who else? I mean, there are some bands like Thin Lizzy, of course, even though they're not they're more metal adjacent than anything else. And by the time that they're in the mid 70s, they've got Scott Gorham there, who's an American. There were American bands like Montrose are influencing some of the new wave of British heavy metal bands, but UFO is also a huge influence. Steve Harris of Iron Maiden says that Pete Way was one of his biggest influences. So, you know, Venom is coming in, and they are important for a certain genre. I don't think they're really influential on the rest of what's going on in the new wave of British heavy metal. And I don't think that they're influential on like power metal or some of the other genres that are coming out of it. But we should talk about the influence thing. So like Scott was pointing out, you know, it's a really fertile period and a short time frame, you know, less than a decade and a half from the inception of rock and roll to this booming in the 1980s. I mean, when you think about these bands in the 80s in Britain, Scott, who else do you think I've left out in terms of influences? There's the prog stuff, right? So who would that include?
Oh yeah, so the prog bands, you know, definitely Peter Gabriel era Genesis. We're talking, you know, Lamb Lies Over Broad Street.
Okay.
You know, the 70s Peter Gabriel. You know, and certainly, absolutely, yes. The band, yes. You know, the Fractal album. Everybody owned that record.
Now, why? Why do you think the prog stuff was?
Oh, because, well, the 70s, that's a great question, actually. The 70s was explosive in not only rock, but in jazz. So, you know, Miles Davis, of course, in the 50s and 60s was playing My Funny Valentine and all this stuff. And then you have the 70s where he said, I'm sick of this. I'm going to go, it's going to be one chord. It's going to be a half-hour composition. It's going to be all the musicians interacting with each other. Then you get to the late 70s where he's getting like John Scofield and Mike Stern on guitar. And they wanted to impress Miles with all these fast jazz licks. And he said, he would stop and say, hey, Mike Stern, don't play that stuff. Turn it up and play like Hendrix. Because Jimi Hendrix was actually booked to play on Bitches Brew. But Jimmy died before that record came out, the Miles Davis record I'm speaking of. But we also had, you know, these people like Robert Fripp, these British guitar players that were very experimental. Brian Eno, you know, we had all these people that were experimental and like Peter Gabriel. And this was like completely new. People that were listening to Stravinsky, people that were listening, but they wanted loud guitars, like on the Yes stuff. You know, they'd crank the amp and have a guitar, and so it had rock qualities to it, right? And you'd have the singer kind of, you know, whatever the band was, you have the singer kind of belting it out. And I think, you know, I'll definitely say Steve Harris put that together incredibly well, because I want to go back to something you said, the Paul Di'Anno period, and we were talking about this the other day. I said, you know, it's definitely got a punk flavor. And you said, like, you know, Steve Harris said there was no punk in there. And we both agreed that Paul Di'Anno was the factor or the variable that made them punk. You know,
yeah. I mean, I think Steve Harris is right that Iron Maiden is not itself punk. There are some musical aspects that are in common, like the drive ahead raw energy, speeding things up.
Right.
But the thing that Harris talks about in interviews is he said these punk players weren't very good. Technically, you know, they didn't focus on their instruments. And you can also say that about Venom. I mean, Henry Rollins famously, like, you know, said when we played with them, they actually couldn't play. They got better over time, you know. But and so there, I think you could say there's something of the punk mentality. But I don't think there's like influence by punk where they're like we should sound like these punk bands. We should, for example, the lyrical quality or lyrical content. This is something that like Donna Weinstein in her book on heavy metal, she focuses on quite a bit. And there's another really good book out there called, and I don't remember who it's by, This Ain't the Summer of Love, contrasting punk and heavy metal. And, you know, the lyrics could be similar. So think about Running Free for Iron Maiden, right? It's a classical rebel against the world. He's got a pickup truck. He's out of money. He's out of luck. He's going to be in prison or jail. And it's him against the world. And that is probably one of the most punkish songs of Iron Maiden at the time. But it's not punk in the way that we're used to seeing in the 70s developing. There's a different aesthetic. There's a different set of, you could call them non-political commitments. Again, that's something that Weinstein is really focused on. And heavy metal was viewed by a lot of people as escapism, as not being politically committed when it should be, like punk was. Now, granted, Paul Di'Anno is essentially a punk singer, you know? And maybe that's why he didn't fit so well with Iron Maiden. Algie Ward, one of the other, you know, so Algie Ward played in actual punk bands, the Damned, the Saints, right? And then he comes to Tank, and he's the driving factor. He hires these two brothers, the Brobs brothers, to play guitar and play drums. And you know, when he's asked about it, he said, "No, we weren't punk. We were high energy. We were aggressive. We were going to do whatever the hell we wanted to, but we weren't like these punk bands over there." So I'm, you know, and then if we get away from those examples and we're looking at something like Raven, I don't know, is Raven even close to punk, or is or take Def Leppard, right? There's nothing that you would look at with old Def Leppard and say, well, that sounds like a punk band to me.
Not Def Leppard, no.
Yeah, or Saxon, right? So I think
Saxon was almost the early Saxon stuff. I feel like, you know, the stuff they put out kind of around the same time as Maiden or the year after, I feel like some of the guitar parts were Maiden-esque.
Yeah.
I feel like what you said, that, you know, the peers were kind of like hearing each other and incorporating stuff. But, you know, even Queens were like a Seattle band. But I feel like Def Leppard was the center for a lot of the bands you're speaking of.
Yeah.
Definitely like Denim and Leather, that album. What year was that? Was that 83?
That sounds about right. It might have been 82. Strong Arm of the Law is what, 81, I think. So, and actually, so Mark Ass was Motorhead's first album, Punk. And so this is kind of a good segue into talking about something else that's connected to what Scott is bringing up as well. So the bands that were influencing each other, Judas Priest and Motorhead, are exerting a big influence on the scene at the time. I wouldn't say that Motorhead's first album is punk. I would say it's very gritty metal, and Motorhead themselves don't define themselves as metal or punk. They would say we just play rock and roll, but they play rock and roll turned up as much as you can, using Lemmy's kind of unique approach where the bass is also the rhythm guitar. And you know, I mean, so Larry Wallace, right, is coming out of the Pink Fairies, arguably a punk band. I guess you could say really early Motorhead has more punkish aspect to it, but I think it's some people want to say it's like a crossover band, but I don't know. I think it's still more metal than punk.
I mean, the thing about, you know, Lemmy always said, we're not metal, we're rock and roll.
Yeah.
You know, he always considered himself, you know, well, I don't know if I didn't hear him say this, but I feel like he considered himself the Rolling Stones, more drunk and turned up louder, you know.
You know, in another interview, he said he liked the Beatles instead of the Stones because
right.
I think we talked about this before, because the Stones were coming essentially from a bourgeois sort of background, and the Beatles were real working people.
From Liverpool, yeah.
So it was kind of interesting. He is a very important class dynamics. But going back to it, you know. So this is something I do want to say, and I realize we've been all over the map so far. when people talk retrospectively about the new wave of British heavy metal, they often include Motorhead and Judas Priest in there. And then other people will come along and say, no, they can't be new wave of British heavy metal because they were already established acts by 1980 and exerting a significant, let's call it a significant influence on the scene, right? And part of that influence was by actually offering these newer acts the possibility of touring with them. So like Girlschool tours with Motorhead, for example, or Iron Maiden actually at one point tours with Judas Priest as the opener for Judas Priest. So these bands are, I like to call them catalysts or precursor bands, you know, in the chemical sense. They are providing a basis for these newer bands to come in. You know, so oftentimes people say, oh, what was the new wave of British heavy metal? Judas Priest, Saxon, Iron Maiden, Leppard, Motorhead. And really only, you know, Iron Maiden, Saxon, and Def Leppard fit into that new wave of British heavy metal. But that doesn't mean that these other bands aren't important and aren't playing a really central role. I would say as well that Gillan's band, Gillan, was playing a pretty important role as a precursor band at the time, as was Rainbow. You know, although Rainbow starts to take a more AOR, hard rock kind of direction. And then UFO was doing the same thing at the time as well, you know. So go ahead.
Not to interrupt, I'm sorry. I think I was going to bring this up at some point, but you did. You know, we can talk about, you know, Deep Purple, the late 60s, so they're off. But, you know, Richie Blackmore reinvents himself and gets Joe Lynn Turner in the band.
Yeah.
And they get back together. Well, actually, no, he got back with Ian Gillan for Perfect Strangers in 83.
83, yeah. No, or was it 84? I think it was 84. Yeah.
And so, yeah, okay, that's a new Deep Purple album. But Rainbow, you know, there's this thing. It's like if you listen to, you know, Difficult to Cure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's AOR in the sense that it's a little more melodic as far as like, you know, AOR, adult-oriented rock or melodic rock. But Blackmore and the riffs and everything didn't suffer. So I wouldn't discount Rainbow unless you just want to discount that like Blackmore's been in the business for a while. But I do think when those records came out, they were kind of fresh for the times.
Yeah.
The Rainbow records.
I think there is a shift. This is something that you and I have talked about a bit, from the organ use, right? As the keyboard use to more 1980s synth keyboard, which is a bit of a softer and more high-end sound, I would say. With organs, you have, like in Rainbow. So Rainbow was a band that was like Deep Purple, like Uriah Heep, where the organ and the guitar are occupying a lot of similar sonic space, right? Both of them can do riffs. So like when Deep Purple is playing and Richie Blackmore is soloing, the riff is being done by John Lord, you know, or in Uriah Heep, it's whoever was on the keyboard at the time. They lost keyboard players from time to time. I think moving away from the albums that Dio was on, there were so many other changes in the background that I think the keyboard sound, like, so when you think about like Street of Dreams, right? That is a prime example of 1980s Rainbow. And it's using a keyboard. And it's not to say that you can't do it. I mean, Dio on Holy Diver and Last in Line, same sort of keyboard, but it's being used with I would say a heavier guitar riff. I think he had Jimmy Bain on bass, right? Who'd come over from Rainbow at that time, and the bass stuff on on those early albums is also really heavy too. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you. We shouldn't totally write off Rainbow, and I wasn't meaning to do that, or UFO for that matter, which was also doing a similar shift.
Just to add to the list, I mean, they're not British, they're German, but
okay.
The Scorpions, they get rid of Uli John Roth, Michael Schenker, and then we have the new 1981 version of Love at First Sting. You know, here's where some bands.
That's 1984. right?
Oh God.
Because
Oh,
because
it is.
Love Drive is the one where
You're
they
right.
switched, but and there is a difference in sound.
A complete difference. So
Yeah,
I think this is something you said at the beginning of this whole thing, is that, something we should consider is a complete change in the personnel, like Diano going to Bruce
yeah,
Dickinson. Uh,
yeah.
Otherwise the same band, but a completely different sound by Number of the Beast.
And so one of the things we were going to talk about later on in this is the challenges that some of the new wave of British heavy metal bands went through, because there was a scene, right? And so we can talk about there being a British scene. We can talk about there being a broader European scene. We can talk about a New York scene, an LA scene developing in this time. And when you have a scene, you have all these different possibilities for people to go from place to place. And so if you get fired from one band, you can go to another one. There were some bands in the new wave of British heavy metal that never really attained a stable lineup. And that's part of what killed them. If Iron Maiden hadn't finally settled down, because in their early years, they people were kind of shuffling in and out, right? And if you don't have a stable lineup, you can't have really a stable sound. You can't gel together as a band and progress. And so some of the bands that were quite, interesting and had some real prospects, but never really made it to the next level would be like Tigers of Pantang or Angel Witch. Angel Witch was a very important band in the early part of new wave of British heavy metal, but they weren't able to sustain what they were doing because people were constantly going in and going out. At one point somebody said it's basically whoever's the guitar guys got playing with them, right? And so you can't attain the musical equivalent of an ethos by doing that, I think, right? I mean, it's different when you have a solo act. Like Ozzy Osbourne can fire everybody and hire all new people, and it'll still be Ozzy's voice. And in a way, it matters because he doesn't write his own songs. So, who he's got backing him up will matter quite a bit. But Sharon actually handled all of that, right? Hiring and firing people. But when it comes to a band where you don't have a single identifiable front person, you really need to have the same set of people, right? Mark has an interesting point. Diamond Head were a great band that went nowhere. Yeah, and in that case, it wasn't so much about turnover. The two biggest challenges were management. They allowed the management to be family members, never a good idea, right? And they changed their sound by their third album. They were moving more towards a less metal, more. I'm not sure how you describe it. Their Canterbury album. I guess you could say AOR kind of sound, and so that lost them some people. A lot of the problems too are getting and keeping record deals. Record companies would sometimes stiff the bands. They'd have them do a tour in support of a particular band that was well established, and then they would just they'd destroy the deal afterwards. So if you didn't have somebody like in your corner looking out for you, it was pretty easy to get screwed. And a lot of those things had nothing to do with musical talent or quality. It was just, bad luck in some respect.
Well, I do want to say, that's a great point, and if I can interject on the business side in history, actually, this is something we didn't even discuss. I know everybody said the record companies were horrible, they were demons, and yeah, some bands signed bad deals. But here's the thing: take so many bands that did 6 flop albums, but the company kept investing in them because they said it's going to pay off, right? So it's the old school, cigar chomping executive back then.
Yeah.
And they would say, well, this band sold 1 million or 2 million in the first week or whatever, and let's do that. Let's do more of that. The problem came in when they got the young guys with ponytails in there and said, go out and get these bands. And then it became exactly what you said. And, this was more kind of in the 90s where I have a friend that had a band that was a metal band, from the Boston area. I won't name them, but their first album went gold. Their second album sold pretty well, but not good enough, and they got dropped from the label, which I won't mention. But back then, you know, if you did sign an okay deal, like let's say, you know, some of these bands, they could have been like shoved a contract while they're half drunk after a set at a club, signed away their soul. Bad on them. But at least back then, there's a lot of bands. I mean, I know for a fact, like, I don't know why this isn't metal at all, but REO Speedwagon put out like 6 or 7 flop albums. And then High Infidelity came out, and Epic made millions and millions off that album. So that was it's kind of like Cheers. If anybody remembers the show Cheers.
Yeah.
The first 6, 7 seasons flopped, but, you know, they knew they had something there. So now, but then you remember like TV in the 90s, a show didn't get the ratings they want on the first one, and then you'd see the pilot and then it would just disappear. So I think you're right that a lot of them did get screwed out of deals back then. You're completely right. But by the 90s, it was just ridiculous. And, you know, now I think a lot of people are praying for the record companies, because nowadays what a metal band has to do is come up with a Kickstarter or, you know, 20
right.
grand, and invest their own money, and then they hand it over to Spotify or Bandcamp to take the lion's share of it. At least, you know, if Epic Records signed a metal band back in the 80s, they'd say, here's 20 grand to record an album. We're going to put you on tour, pay for your hotels. You're going to sell merch, and we're going to take a big percentage to recoup our investment. Well, that sure beats you investing it and then going nowhere. And then just, you know, so I think that's an important.
And, you know, there was also the rise of smaller independent record labels that could step in and be a bit more, you could say, more speculative in terms of their investing, or risky in terms of their investing, but it would be smaller amounts. Like, we'll press, you know, 4,000 copies of your EP, and then we'll see how it sells in the record stores. But there was also a distribution network that is lacking today. Let's go take a few of these questions and comments here. So Mark has a good point. Grim Reaper missed the bus. There were a lot of great new wave of heavy metal bands that would have done better if their albums had come out 2 years earlier. And that's something we'll talk about.
That's a great point. Yeah, Grim Reaper. Absolutely.
You know, Chrome Molly is another example of a really good new wave of British heavy metal band, but their stuff came out from like 1984 onward, and there were certain, let's call them musical forces and market forces, that began to really restrict not heavy metal itself, but certain kinds of heavy metal, and then favor other kinds of heavy metal. So like MTV becoming the massive influencer that it was, and MTV for a while was actually almost dominated by heavy metal. They had to like start restricting it and, like, you know, have just a show for it, right? Because otherwise people were constantly requesting it. But they weren't requesting new wave of British heavy metal bands. They weren't they would request Iron Maiden, but they weren't requesting Raven. They weren't requesting Venom. They weren't requesting these other bands. Instead, it was American glam bands for the most part. So that was a major influence. And then, you know, by the time that we get into the late 80s and early 90s, that becomes the really tough period for quite a few metal bands whose arc, you're right, if it had been a little bit earlier, they probably would have done a bit better. So that's, I think, what were you going to say, Scott? I know you had something on your mind with that.
Well, I have a few things. First of all, Chris, the bird sounds, that's me. We have parakeets. That's why I mute myself when Greg's talking, so it doesn't distract. So I hope that's not bothering everyone. If you don't mind, I want to get to some of these questions that I think are great.
Absolutely.
So, Chris, Kansas is a great example of a band whose record company stood by them. You know, you're absolutely right. Kansas, big time. You know, and then, you know, of course, they come out with the greatest hits, they could have put like a double album for that. And, you know, I want to go back. Kansas was a huge influence on, like Dream Theater. I don't, you know, maybe if you ask some of the British metal bands, but Kansas was a band that was playing prog. They were, you know, it was kind of classical composition parts, these long nice compositions where it wasn't just, let's go back to, the 50s with Elvis. Elvis was fantastic. All that music was great. Or early Beatles where it's, 3 chords, but great 3 chords. But now you have bands like Kansas, and I forgot to mention them. So Chris, that's a great point. Alfonso, I didn't want to miss this. Those types of deals seem like light years away from Spotify corporizing happening now. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Cents on the cents of the dollar. Here's your royalty check. And, that's why I've pulled all my stuff off of there. If you want to, I have plenty of free videos for people to see on YouTube, but I sell my stuff through my website and I keep 100% of it. And I sell it for less than CD Baby would or Amazon. So, that's a different subject.
This brings up a kind of interesting digression. And maybe you have I think I've brought this up before, and maybe you have some better insight on this, Scott. So there's quite a few bands, including Budgie, who Chris brought up, where you can't get a lot of their stuff on iTunes. Or, well, now it's Apple Music, or in Google Play or other things. And it seems like Apple Music kind of leads it. If it's available there, it's going to be available in other places.
Right.
And, so with Budgie, their first 2 albums are available from 1971, 1972. Nothing else. If you want, I was listening last night to one of the ones that I put into the discography as a set of recommendations. And if you want to find it, you have to go to YouTube. And it is available there, not in YouTube Music, by the way, but just because some fan uploaded it and it hasn't been taken down yet by anybody. And there's so many of these new wave of British heavy metal bands where a good portion of their catalog is just not available. Tank is a prime example. You can't find a good portion. You can't find Honor and Blood, which is probably their best album, I would say, from 1984. You can find a few of their things, but you can't find the rest. And it's also if you search Tank, you get this rapper from Milwaukee, unfortunately, is the main thing. So I get how with some of the really obscure bands that don't really have a presence because they broke up and nobody's even quite sure maybe who owns their music, why that wouldn't be available. But with the bands that do exist and are still out there, what's going on? Why would only 2 albums of Budgie be available when all this other, they've got a massive catalog? Why? What's the story with that? Do you have any idea? Because it frustrates the hell out of me.
First of all, when a lot of these bands, when they signed the record deals, they didn't read that the record company owns it. Oh. So, for example, well, I don't know why Joni Mitchell came up, but all the stuff she did for, the Wild Things Run Fast, the early 80s, she did 4 albums for, I don't remember the company, but they went out of print because the company wasn't making money, and she had to go, Geffen. She had to go to David Geffen's office and say, the tapes are just sitting there, give them to me. They're like, no, give us $1 million, So this is what happens with metal bands. Now, do you notice that a lot of the metal bands in the last 15, 20 years have been re-recording albums, like Great White, for example, re-recorded the first album.
Okay.
But now, and the reason they did that is because they don't own the tapes of the first album and they can't put it out. Or if it's put out.
So they're not remastering. They're actually entirely recording the tracks.
Yeah, they do. So Great White did the first album, Lady Red Light On, and they did it as close as they could to the original, which is impossible, but it was close. And here's the thing, because I forget their label. If the label put it out, they said Great White gets 0% of the sales. So for Great White, they still own their publishing and they still own their songwriting. So if they re-record the whole album and put it out and fans buy it, they get 100% of it. So I think Lynch Mob just did that, right? So George Lynch and Lynch Mob just did Wicked Sensation, recorded that whole album again. And the reason was because they don't own the rights to the recording. They own the rights to the songs. So, I almost want to buy it to hear it, but also, George is a legend. But I think this is what you're asking is pretty much, why aren't these albums available? And your first thought is, well, if the bands were on it, they just put it on their website, but they'd be sued.
Yeah.
because they don't own.
Yeah, and it's kind of a problem from a, let's call it, music education perspective, because if, like, so the discography that I made, and I just kind of put a easy one together. We could put together much longer ones. People have done that on websites. If you can't actually get these albums, you can't hear what's being offered. So, good example of this would be some of the, let's call them second tier bands like Chrome Molly or Jaguar. If there's no availability of their music, no ready availability, you're not going to get a new generation of fans into it, and they'll just disappear. It's sort of like going into the old monastic library archives, and then there could be a renaissance when people come in and rediscover this stuff, but that's leaving everything up to chance in many respects.
What I would do, just my 2 cents, and not that I'm pretending to know better than these bands what to do, because everyone's in a situation. But
yeah.
Let's say if it was my catalog, I would probably get the band together. Let's say it was a band, and I would rehearse for a month, and 6 days a week, and then sell tickets to a House of Blues show, and do 2 shows that are the same. So a 7 to 8:30, and then a 10 to 11:30 shows.
Okay.
Show, and then I would put out a live album, because in the end, most of these bands own the publishing and the writing credits, the music, which is where the money is. So you put out a live album,
yeah,
and then that's available, and it's got your old hits that the fans might want to hear. You maybe put a few new tunes, but that's how it would draw a new generation. So bands like Strange Ways and some of the AOR bands, they lost the rights to it, and they would do shows in the last 5 years, and they'd say, these 20-year-old kids were coming up to us, and we were big in '86, and we said, how did you find us? And they said, YouTube. And
and there are a lot of new wave of British heavy metal bands that, because of the let's call it renaissance of metal in the 2000s, they're back together, and they're producing stuff. Sometimes it's it's very different than what their original stuff was, but they usually also have to play the fan favorites, right, from their old catalog. So
I just Alfonso asked a great question. Music publishing is so complicated. You know what? He's absolutely right.
What do you think about, I get nauseated just speaking the words. I mean, there probably is kind of a reaction of, what is this nonsense, and so that's a good segue, actually. So back to the music itself, right? One of the things, we'll talk in a bit about how distribution changed and how bands were able to get out there, but I really wanted to bring Scott on again to talk about sonic elements and the technology. When we talk about the new wave of British heavy metal, metal has gotten faster, it's gotten heavier in some respects than stuff that was happening in the 70s. How did that happen? What was driving that? It's not just like the thrash thing where people are like, let's play as fast as we possibly can. And that's not what's going on. There's other things that are happening in terms of the instruments, in terms of the amps, right, and in terms of playing styles. So I'm going to turn that entirely over to you.
So we look back now and we'll say, Richie Blackmore, what a tone. Or any even Ted Nugent, or anybody from the Detroit sound, MC5, and was there something in the water, we all ask, and we come to find out that they weren't gear back in the 70s in the 70s, let's say, was pretty much, you had a few things. For amps, you had the Marshall stacks, or you had the clean Fender amps, right? Those were the 2 choices you basically had. There was some other companies, but and then there was a few. You could have a Gibson or a Fender. Essentially, those were you either saw someone with a Tele, a Strat by Fender, or a Gibson Les Paul and Marshalls, and that's what was available. Like Peter Frampton Comes Alive, Marshalls and Les Pauls. And we look back and go, wow, those are amazing tones. And if you ask any of these guitarists, and I have, they go, I'd like to tell you that there was a magic to it, but we just used what gear was there. And so I told Greg, just to jump ahead for a second, to give you a balance thing. So and I don't know why I'm using this band as an example. It's just because I happen to see them live and be shocked. So Loverboy, the early 80s, great guitar tones, Les Paul and a Marshall. And then I saw a show with like Joan Jett and Loverboy and all these bands, one of the summer tours. And the guy was using a Marshall. It's called the JCM 900. Now, let me explain. That amp was made, it's a Marshall in the 90s. As time went on, these amp companies made amps have more distortion. So in the past, they would just like, you know, the UFO or whatever, they cranked the Marshall and you'd get some gain, but it wasn't like mushy. So the 900 was probably the mushiest, crappiest sounding amp for that stuff, but the guitarist was using it. And, you know, my thing was like, you had great tone. What happened? I just use what's around, you know, whatever the new thing is, it's on stage or it's in the studio. So this brings to the thing about 1980. So Greg had mentioned, you know, organ versus keyboard sound. So I think about 82, 83, there's a keyboard that was polyphonic, and that means you could play more than one note at a time. And you can get a kind of an organ sound, kind of a piano sound. And it was compact. So producers would get bands in the studio and go, this is the new thing. This is it. It's compact. You don't have to lug all this stuff. And, you know, we could take Judas Priest Turbo that we talk about, right? Which may have been a little ambitious on the DX7. Well, that was probably DX7. And
that's a nice euphemism for it.
Ambitious. Yeah. And so I think what happened was we heard guitars get more and more gainy, but let's just say surreal sounding. It's not that AC/DC, that one chord you can hear the. Now, when we get to the Def Leppard album, Hysteria, and Iron Maiden, Somewhere in Time, which was approximately the same time, both.
You mean Pyromania?
No. Hysteria. So Hysteria was like.
Oh, right. Well, yeah.
So,
late 80s, yeah.
I'm assuming everybody knows the band Boston, you know, Don't Look Back and, you know, More Than a Feeling. But there's a sound that was made by the guitarist Tom Schultz, who was an MIT graduate. So he built the first digital amp back then. And so what it was is you would, instead of like a tube amp, they would crank up, you would have this digital amp with effects built into it and you would plug in. So all of Hysteria was made with what was called the Rockman. And the Rockman was this digital amp that the sounds you hear on the Boston albums. And so Hysteria and Somewhere in Time were, now this is sacrilege, right? We have these guys that were cranking Marshalls with Les Pauls and Strats, getting these great tones, now running with the technology. And if you have Somewhere in Time, there's guitar synth on it, right? On Stranger in a Strange Land. And I think it sounds cool, the ba-ba-do, and then that chord that happens that sounds like a synth. That's Adrian Smith playing this guitar synth. So this stuff didn't exist in the 70s. But not only was it the new stuff, and these players, it turns out, used just what was in the studios, you know, like, or, you know, what they bought. There wasn't, as now we have a million boutique amp companies, a million boutique pedal companies. Now it's like out of control. But even in the 80s, nobody was doing what the 70s was. So in other words, Adrian Smith went to a Jackson, which is like a super Strat. So Fender Strats were made by Leo Fender in the 50s, maybe earlier. We made the Nocaster. So anyways, if you notice the pointy guitars in the 80s and the hockey stick headstocks.
Yeah.
So these were things that were like, these are going to stay in tune better. These are going to, you know, we have these new pickups we've made. And so now they're starting to play and the sound is changing.
Oh.
So, you know, it's like, you know, everybody's like, we've made groundbreaking things to the technology of the 70s. So, and the Floyd Rose, Alfonso. And yeah, so they had these trem bars that you could pull up and push down and hit to make cricket sounds. That didn't exist in the 70s. The
So
Floyd Rose.
let me ask you one sort of very pointed question about sound stuff. So, you know, a lot of people associate distortion with metal. And when you listen to 70s metal, there's a lot of overdriving, right? As you're pointing out. And then if you take a band like Judas Priest as a prime example, because there we've got continuity, right? You listen to Sin After Sin, and then compare that to British Steel. There's been a progression in terms of like how much is going on. And I would say that, you know, there is distortion being used on some of the songs in Sin After Sin. Like think about Let Us Pray or Dissident Aggressor, but it's not being used in the same almost like routine way. By the time that you get to British Steel, let alone Screaming for Vengeance, it's like, well, this is just the way we play our guitars now. It's distorted. And a lot of the new wave of British heavy metal bands, there's going to be some measure of distortion. It probably won't be there in a lot of the guitar solos, right? Then you're switching and you're playing a more clean sound, I think, on a lot of the solos. But with the riffs, it's so where is this coming from technologically? Is it pedals that are now coming into play? Is it the way that the system is set up?
Pedals weren't in play yet. So what Greg is talking about with pedals is normally you'd plug your guitar right into the amp, and there's tubes in it because there's tubes in TVs and radios. And just by default, and Leo Fender, the inventor of Fender guitars and amps.
Oh yeah.
He always wanted his amps clean, but everybody found out if they turned the amp all the way up, it would put the tubes in distress.
These damn kids.
Yeah, and he was like, "Get off my lawn!" So he would keep making these amps harder because he wanted country players to play them clean. So, anyways, what happened was there was the JMP Marshall in the late '70s, and that was still you had to turn the volume all the way up, and it would distort, put the tubes in distress. Then there was this new wave of metal, like, you know, and it was getting heavier. The genre wanted to progress, but the companies came out. So JCM 800, the 800 means 80s. The JCM 900 means 90s. The JCM 2000 means the 2000s. So when the 800 comes out, and now if you turn it up, it's even more mushy or gainy. Then and don't quote me on this, I think 83, 84, they added an extra gain stage in the 800. So now this was showing up in the studios, and take someone like John Sykes, from Whitesnake, or from Thin Lizzy before.
Yeah.
He was just cranking the old Marshalls, and by the time the 800 came along, his tone changed entirely, much more distorted. But I think he had control over the sound. So you gonna say something, Greg? Or
well, I was wondering. So it with the earlier things, I mean, this partly goes to one of the key definitional elements of heavy metal, which people are going to say, well, this is super trivial. It gets played loud, right? And I'm just remembering again in that Algie Ward interview, Fast Eddie Clarke produced one of their albums. It was the second album, and his advice was basically, you just need to be louder. and so I what I'm hearing in part is that being louder wasn't just like a jump in quantity. It's also changing quality. You get more distortion as you're getting louder. So it makes it possible for bands, like when they're recording in the studio, you probably would have had to crank things up, in order to get the distortion effect that you want, right?
And then what I was going to say, what a lot of these companies did is they had something called a master volume. So if I can explain this.
Yeah.
So there's power tubes and preamp tubes. The power tubes are like these big tubes. They look like light bulbs. You turn the amp on, they start glowing. It's pretty cool. So what the goal in the 70s was you crank it and the power tubes go into distress.
Okay.
Then they came up with this thing where we want distortion, but not so loud. So they would have the master volume. So you have the volume and you turn the volume all the way up and push the power tubes into distress. And you take the master volume and dial it down. So now the theory was you'd have much more distortion at much lower volumes.
Okay.
It didn't sound as good. So then these amp companies had to put in specific distortion channels so people could play them not so loud. But this is part of the sonic aspect. So I would say the DX7 and then the D50 for keyboards. We heard synth sounds, and of course Whitesnake, the beginning of Here I Go Again. But even like that Whitesnake album by '87, that's heavy distortion. That's the JCM 800 souped up. And but you listen to John Sykes and Thin Lizzy, he's got the same aggression in his playing. But
you know, this is like totally off topic, and we should take Emily's question in just a a minute, because that'll lead us into something. But I was thinking, so with these developments that you're talking about, and eventually you could say it's a distortion becoming easier and easier to come by and available in a more flexible way, right? Without that, there's no grunge. There's no grunge movement, because one of the things that grunge and heavy metal have in common, besides, you know, hard driving bass lines, is distorted guitars. It's just, you know, there aren't so many guitar solos and things are being done a bit differently, but there's heavy distortion on most of those grunge bands, right?
Well,
and a lot of it's coming, I think, through pedals, isn't it?
I see ears as reactionary. So
okay.
I'm not going to go on such a tangent, but this, I think, this should be said. So the 70s happened. We have guys like Eric Clapton and the Allman Brothers taking 30-minute guitar solos, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, these long jams.
Some might call them self-indulgent.
And then we had the short era of punk, CBGBs in New York City, where bands like the Ramones said, no, 2-minute songs, no solos, and no long endings. You know, like the long endings where they just play one chord and the So the Ramones and all these bands out of New York came. And I think this kind of like was, you know, this
so you see grunge as sort of like a replication of what the punk was doing then in that respect?
Well, in the 70s, because, you know, the hockey stick guitars, all the new gear. In the 80s, that was the last time we heard something brand new. Like, now, when we went to the 90s in grunge, we went back to Les Pauls, Strats, old Marshalls, old Fenders, but they used the big muff pedals, which were from the 70s, which is that wolfy fuzz tone. Like, think of the solo on Wood by Alice in Chains. That really wolfy, like, whoa, whoa, whoa. So that's all 70s gear. So really, grunge was a reaction to, okay, these guys are dressed like women and they have these poofy hair and there's not a mistake and they're technically advanced and they get everything right. Now we're all going to wear flannel, whether we're male or female. We're going to wear Doc Martens. So I call it kind of snidely MTV's introduction to their new hair metal. And their new hair metal is unbathed people in and then, like, you know, bands like Nirvana and Hole would get on MTV Unplugged and they'd play out a tune. They'd stop in the middle and go, we should have rehearsed that. And that was cool.
It was supposed to be authentic then, right? The idea was it was more genuine and
But it was just a reaction to the 80s. Now, as you know, as much as I was living in, I did love Soundgarden and Alice in Chains. I thought there were some great bands, but all in all, I just saw it for what it was. We're not going to look good. You know, it's like the 70s to the 80s. It's like no long solos, and then this is actually where the British heavy metal comes in, where it's kind of like, okay, we're going to like High and Dry by Def Leppard, one of my favorite Def Leppard albums. Great guitar sounds. And that's the old sound, like, you know, the M45s and the Les Pauls and great songwriting. But the reactionary thing is very important. So I think grunge was reactionary, but it was kind of like, we're not going to use the new stuff. We're going to go back to what they were using in the 70s. But we do have new production things like, you know, ways to record.
So when you call it reactionary, I think another way of talking about it philosophically is what we call dialectical, right? Where there's something that's developing out of an opposition to something else, but it's not just like flipping a switch. It's not like you just go right back to the 70s, because like you were saying, the context is different. So there's an opposition and you generate something new. So Emily says, or this is actually, it's Gilad, watching with Emily, to what extent was the new wave of British heavy metal scene mythologized by Kerrang magazine? To what extent did it coincide with British electronic, noise, industrial, or new wave scene? So with the second part, it's not really coinciding as the new wave of British heavy metal with I would say any of those scenes. And new wave is, so, you know, the like industrial's coming later, right? New wave is around, and that's big in the early 80s, but they're doing very different things than new wave of British heavy metal people are doing. And I don't see any real crossover between them. In part, they would be hard to have crossover because there's not a lot of musical continuity between the two, you know. New wave of British heavy metal is heavily guitar driven, virtuoso guitar performances, riffs, you know, the bass. The one continuity you could say is maybe in bass, right? And that's something that's often overlooked. Maybe we'll come back to that in a bit. But to go to the question about, is this a real movement or not? I think that's what the question is. So yes and no. So Jeff Barton is the person who coins the term, and he uses it to try to bring a bunch of bands into one category, and they are in England, right? So he was told by Alan Lewis, and this is before Kerrang starts. This is when he's still with Sounds, which is a British weekly. And I should mention too, the British weeklies, Sounds was the only one that was really interested in covering metal stuff. In the 1970s, metal stuff was looked at as being kind of, that's for stupid people, you know, people whose musical tastes don't matter. And so Jeff Barton's, you know, kind of exploring new territory. And so he uses this term in a review of a gig on the Metal Crusade tour that has Angel, Witch, Iron Maiden, and Samson at the Music Machine in London. And he's talking about this as being a new movement. Now, if you're looking at those bands, those are actually, I would say, closer together in sound than what the ultimate new wave of British heavy metal is going to encompass. You know, you could say that there's extremes, right? Where like Venom might be at one extreme, and more melodic bands like Praying Mantis or Tigers of Pantang at another, Iron Maiden like solidly in the middle, Def Leppard maybe more on well, I mean, they're a whole different animal. Saxon, and there's a wider range that's being generated, and once it gets picked up as a notion, it takes on a life of its own. And Kerrang magazine is really central to it. Is it a mythos, or is it mythologized by it? It depends on what we mean by mythologized. So that's actually a great way to think about it. Is there a lot of like puffery and bullshit involved in this? Definitely. When you read through articles, and even more so if you like look at how it was done here in America with Circus and Hit Parader picking up on it. Right?
Oh yeah.
I mean,
Mom, will you give me the new Circus?
Yeah, we used to get it at the drugstore, you know, and I
That's right, me too.
Yeah, and actually, by the time that I was doing that, essentially the new wave of British heavy metal had run its course, because I was in high school by then. But there really was something going on. It's just there isn't one single essence. I would say it is more of a historical or sociological phenomenon. And this is where we get into something I did want to discuss.
Oh wait, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Absolutely.
I apologize. I don't want to.
Oh no.
I wanted to interject on Emily's the last part of her question. To what extent did it coincide with British electronic noise industrial? Now I agree they don't really, but here's the thing that I always wonder. Okay. By the time Depeche Mode hit the 90s, and Depeche Mode started off as like a synth pop band.
Yeah.
But then they became very dark, very heavy, and then they led to bands like Pop Tigma, Berserk, Norwegian synth pop metal bands.
Yeah.
You know, I'd have to say, as far as the sonic influence. So, like, if you listen to Violator or, any of the '90s, it's very dark. It's got Dave Gahan is this great front man who's kind of like,
yeah,
you know, and
you could almost say, is this metal, not in the sense of is it the genre of metal, but is it metal like the ethos of metal? You know?
That's what I'm saying. I think.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. So like, you know, I went to the show and I got the vibes because the synth bass is hitting me, and Martin Gore playing guitar, but he's not playing heavy guitar. He's playing these nice parts. But you know, you have Gahan being the front man, like, you know, well, like Freddie Mercury, or, you know, just a great front man, yelling, getting the crowd going. So yeah, I guess you nailed it. It's, I think bands like that have that ethos of, in industrial, it has maybe the impact we might feel from heavy metal, but we wouldn't call them heavy metal, I guess. So I think it's a fair question that she asks.
Yeah, and I think those developments are coming later than the new wave of British heavy metal, we can say.
It is.
So what we can say is that it feeds into it in some of the bands, right?
And these guys, like, you know, I saw Dave Gahan and Martin Gore interviewed, and they did say, you know, they were asked, who'd you like? They loved Black Sabbath. They loved.
Interesting.
They grew up with those records when they were young.
Yeah.
But, you know, they became, you know, when the 80s came and synths came out and they found their own path, they did their own thing, which doesn't mean they didn't have their Sabbath records. So by the 90s, time of the 90s, they became doom and gloom, and you know, you got your money's worth for a show with them. So I just think that's kind of a cool thing, because I was trying to plug that in myself, was well, you know, some of these bands, Pop Tigma, Berserk, you know, the guitarist is playing heavy, and they're like, they look like Motley Crue, but it's kind of like a super heavy. Well, it's kind of like there would be no Nine Inch Nails without Depeche Mode. There'd be no. So I think they're pioneers, but they ended up being very heavy.
Yeah.
But not by our criteria, I guess.
Well, they're sort of adjacent. They're almost pursuing something. It's not quite a parallel path, but it's at least a similar path, right? A similar vector.
Sonically and emotionally, possibly.
Yeah. And I mean, that's another thing too. Is metal had not, by the time that we're talking about new wave of British heavy metal, we don't have this proliferation of genres that people take for granted today.
Right.
I mean, we could identify scenes and we could identify sounds. So like, you know, Motorhead, Tank, Raven, similar sounds by comparison to, you know, Wrathchild, which is more glam, right? Or some of the other bands that are around at the time, like Chrome Molly is more poppy than those bands are. But we're not talking about like actual different distinct genres in 1980. Whereas by 1986, 87, we can talk about some really distinct genres. You know, thrash is on the scene, drawing from new wave of British heavy metal, deliberately, you know, doing its ethos and dress by reaction against the glam stuff, you know. So then, and you could talk about black metal proliferating after that point too. But going back to the mythology thing, I think you can say there was a mythologization, and there always is going to be, in part because there's you know, the metal is larger than life, right? And there's going to be stories that are told that aren't strictly true but make a good story. You know? But what there are some things that we can point at, you could almost say, in terms of communication or material culture. So we talked about record labels earlier, and we talked about you know, the rise of independent labels. So like Raven, you know, was on Neat Records, and Neat Records could come along after Girlschool got dropped by their record label and say, hey, we'll put you on our record label. So there was a lot of that confluence of different labels. There was a lot of pressing of EPs and demos, and those would circulate around. Tape copying and playing was a big thing in Britain at that time, the way it was for like me and Scott, and probably, I'm guessing, for Chris too. I'm not quite sure how old Chris is, but he's probably of the generation where you got a lot of your exposure to bands by somebody saying, man, you got to hear this, let me make you a tape, right? And so that was a significant part of how bands got played. There was also, like, you know, a whole clubs scene. So you would go tour around England, which is, you know, a small enough country where you could be in this bar, and play. And then there were support tours for bigger, more established bands like Blue Oyster Cult, which was big in England at the time, right? Some of these new wave of British heavy metal bands, that's how they got their exposure. Touring with Motorhead, touring with Judas Priest, you know, these well-established bands. But then there was also a media thing too. So there were a few stations where they could get airplay. And that was really important because, you know, these bands were not getting radio play over here in the States, which was, you know, the prime market to break into, except for some really specialized places. But there were some radio stations that would play them in England. Or radio shows at least, right? And then they also got on. This is something Scott and I were talking about, and Nadia was kind of helping out with this. They would get onto these British music shows that people would watch, right? So you know, Top of the Pops, or what were some of the other ones? I'm forgetting the names.
Well, Will Ferrell just did a movie of one of them.
Okay.
Can somebody chime in, because Nadia knows this? And it was weird that Will Ferrell did a movie. It's like Top of the Pops, and people try to get discovered, and some people get discovered. But Top of the Pops is it would happen yearly. Iron Maiden was on it in '86.
Yeah. Girlschool got on there. Judas Priest was on it earlier. Unless I'm mistaking it for a different show. And so, you know, people would get exposed to metal music this way. And there probably was a lot of the reaction of like young people, mostly guys, who are like, holy crap, what is this stuff? The sort of reaction like I had, for example, when Iron Maiden the Trooper was put onto a Van Halen tape that a friend of mine made for me, that just happened to have like an extra, you know, 7 minutes at the end, so he threw the Trooper on, and that was transformative for me. You know,
that was my. You know, I had my radio, and it was actually perfect because there was a thunderstorm happening, and there was this 1 hour of metal this show would play, and this song started that was so intense, and I, you know, remember with our boom boxes we would record it.
Yeah,
and they didn't announce who it was after,
yeah,
so I listened to it over and over. I would show my friends. I go, "Who is this?" And it took me like 6 months to figure out. And then of course I was hooked. But anyways, that's my Trooper story.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. I would actually sit next to my clock radio with a portable cassette player, and I would, like, you know, wait until the DJ was just about to stop and then click record. And that's how I got, you know, exposure to songs that then I could listen to afterwards. Sometimes they would announce it, sometimes they wouldn't. And but in any case, yeah, so there's this whole scene that is developing, and it's not just a scene of like clubs and people going to clubs. It's these distribution networks. It's these networks by which the stuff can be heard. And you could say a lot of it was sort of like right place, right time. As we talked about a little bit earlier, some of the bands were not able to take advantage of that in the way that other bands were. So, for example, Iron Maiden, Saxon, Def Leppard, they were all positioned by the time that this was happening to like break out. Raven always kind of struggled. You know, they had a good fan base. They never managed to make it to the level that some of the others did. Tank also struggled to a certain extent in ways that, say, Motorhead didn't, the band that's probably closest to them in composition and sound. And there were a lot of other bands that just never really were. I mean, they produced some awesome stuff. Witchfinder General is a prime example, you know. If you like new wave of British heavy metal, that's essentially doom metal. Witchfinder General is the band for you. They only managed to put together a couple albums. Some new wave of British heavy metal bands didn't get into it until mid 80s, and I think by then it was a little bit too late, you know, to get the traction that they needed. Now Chris has an interesting point. New wave of British heavy metal is alive and well today. Check out the new album from Witch Hazel this year. Yeah, you know, there's a lot of new wave of British heavy metal bands that have put out albums in, let's say, the last decade or so. Some of them are quite good. Scott was talking about Kickstarters. Raven is a prime example of that. I mentioned they never really got the traction that they needed. They actually had to do a Kickstarter for Extermination, which came out in 2015. They are actually, I went on their website, they're in the process of putting out a new album. And I'm sure it's going to be good. Saxon consistently turns out good albums. Iron Maiden, of course, you know, who don't have, you could say, the commercial pressure. If Iron Maiden wants to put out an album, they can. If they don't want to, they don't have to. They're set for life. Whereas bands like Saxon have to stay on tour. Bands like Raven have to stay on tour. Yeah, there's quite a few of them. Girlschool put out a new album recently. Rock Goddess did as well. And you know, it's kind of nice to listen to this stuff because it takes advantage of the you know, the technology that's available. Sometimes the musicians are actually quite better than they were back in the 80s at you know, musical, because they've had, you know, decades to practice. And
decades of influence, you know, so these people
yeah,
are trying to work stuff out, and then we have the luxury of just taking what they did and, you know, already sounding you know, already taking their struggles and spending some time learning it, and then we already sound good to a degree, thanks to them. And then, you know, we can build on that, and that's how the generations kind of go up. So it's like, you know, the argument, Yngwie is better than Blackmore. Well, there'd be no Yngwie if there was no Blackmore.
yeah.
And like, I disagree with that. I think Blackmore is his own thing. You can't, there's only one Blackmore.
You know, the other thing is too, I think you're right. As musicians are older, they bring a whole set of new experiences that they didn't have when they were in their 20s and 30s to the resolving the problem that you could say is posed by each song. And in some cases, there might be a bit of decline, particularly physical. I mean, you look at like John Mickle Thor, who used to be this, you know, he's a Canadian guy, you know, front man of the band Thor. He'd do all sorts of feats of strength. Now he looks like, you know, he looks like an old guy. and I don't know that he has the pipes anymore. But when it comes to like think about somebody like, again, this is outside of the scope of new wave of British heavy metal, but think about somebody like Rudolf Schenkner, you know, a really great composer, somebody who's content to stay on rhythm guitar and let, you know, whoever it's going to be, you know, his brother, Uli von Roth, Matthias Jobs, handle the solo stuff, but writing really, really good songs. You know, age, I think, would, provided you're using it right, result in better songwriting, you know, in many respects. It's not just, the exception would be when you're just like trying to take on the newest stuff and we're gonna sound like these people, you know, we're gonna do what the kids are doing. That probably doesn't work that well. What were you gonna say, Scott? You've clearly got some views on that.
Well, God, there was a few points that, and you kept adding points. Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, you know, I think what happens with a lot of bands is at this point they phone it in. So they could be writing great albums, but it's like, wow, why were their first 3 albums so fantastic and these are kind of lukewarm? But then, like, you know, Blue Oyster Cult just put a brand new album out 2 weeks ago that I think is in their top 5. You could believe it. They, you know, they did not say, yeah, let's just go in and write some junk. But it does happen, you know. It's like there's bands now that'll put out new albums, like well, even if we take, I don't know if we consider them metal. They're not metal, but they used to be in all the metal magazines. Night Ranger, they put out like 3 albums, and then you go see them play, and they wouldn't play one song from the new album. And I'd say, like, you know, aren't you guys playing the new songs? Well, it's because the albums aren't good. They phoned it in. They put it out just so the fans would say they put something out. And apparently nobody's requesting it. So, you know, to go, but this is something we talked about before. So, but to answer your question, you develop as an artist over the years. And so, yeah, you're correct. You might go in a different direction, but you're developing as an artist, as a musician. So it's not like, you know, great. And then here's me trying to do an album from 30 years ago, except I'm not 18 anymore. You know what I mean? I think that's part of it is, well, it's like Robert Plant. Robert Plant's last album was phenomenal, but it had nothing to do with Led Zeppelin. It didn't have the Zeppelin vibe.
That kind of raises an interesting point about like concerts. When you have these bands that have been around now for decades and decades, and so Saxon would be a great example. Raven would be another one. The question is, when you're playing your older catalog stuff from the 80s, should you play it like it would have sounded in the 80s, or should your sound be, let's call it updated, right? Should you do things a bit differently in terms of the sonic profile of how you're having all the instruments calibrated in terms of the sound of the bass, sound of the guitar? Should you drum the same way, or should you use heavier forms of drumming that became sort of standard from about the late 80s onward? it's kind of an interesting question, you know. So like when you see Judas Priest play some of their songs in concert, and Andy and I have seen Judas Priest 4 times in the last decade. You know, there are some songs that they did from certain periods that they're not going to play it exactly like that, you know.
I mean, I have a feeling, my own opinion, and people might disagree. If a band's gonna, let's say Judas Priest puts out a brand new album today,
Yeah.
and there's no COVID and there's a tour. What I would like to see is them put out the best record they can, no matter if it's an acoustic album or if it's something completely different. Now, what they should do is they should play at least 6 songs from the 5-6 songs from the new album. But if they're going to play the classic stuff, I think if they're going to play it, they should play it like the classic stuff. This is something that in the 90s, George Lynch, I felt like he went wrong. So he had a post-Lynch Mob band that was grunge. So here's the point where he was trying to play like the kids. And then when he did the Dawkins songs, he had a guy like a Cookie Monster voice trying to do Unchain the Night and like, you know, with drop.
Okay. Yeah.
And so, you know, all people like us were going, boo, you know, like, you know, if you want to do the new stuff, but then when you do the old stuff, you know, it's cool. Like if you want to do hits, do the hits. And you can change the arrangements, but, you know, I always get bummed out when a band's like, we're going to do a half-hour acoustic set of a medley of all our old hits. And it's like, oh, well, don't do them then. Just do the new album. You know, like,
yeah. There's one from a thing from Alfonso. He says, I think in genres like R&B, the evolution of recorded music allowed vocalists to sing in non-traditional ways, for example, beyond classical training and in a more singy, drony way. In contemporary metal, though, vocalists have gone the other way as far as doing extreme vocalizations in a controlled way. So what may sound like an uncontrolled scream is actually done with technique. They can actually last on a tour and be able to speak in general. So in McLuhan way, the microphone, in addition to amplifying sound, allowed people to sing softer and sing in new ways. Yeah, I think that's completely right. I mean, vocals now are so much more of a technical performance than they were, say, in the 1980s, when I think most people were kind of winging it. You know?
Yeah, and you know, it's the R&B thing. That's a great thing to bring up because you have freaks of nature like Sam Cooke, who's one of the greatest singers that ever lived, I think. Sarah Vaughan, or you know, and some of these people, not them, but you know, were extreme drunks and heroin addicts. Sam Cooke wasn't, but you know, they were singing from, they were pioneers. But as it went on, then you get into like the 80s R&B, the 90s, or the 70s even, well, the post Temptations and everything. And I think, well, again, I have to go back to, we have the influence of, you know, Steve Perry from Journey is a Sam Cooke clone. You know, he admits it. And, you know, he has all the same riffs, but, you know, you could tell he just sang to those Sam Cooke records all the time. But then even post Steve Perry, everybody wanted to sing like that. So they got this vocal training that got this more controlled way. I think that's the thing we're saying is that now instead of like Janis Joplin screaming into the mic and being drugged out, we have people that will do that. Or what's the band? Where are they from? Norway? The super heavy metal band. It's got that short blonde female singer. And she sings like.
Oh, I don't know.
So,
yeah, maybe one of the younger people can fill that one in.
They're a great band, and she would sing like lovely melodies, and then all of a sudden, like this Cookie Monster voice, not Warlock. I'll remember. But anyways,
okay.
How does she do that? Like if this was 1969, you know, halfway through the tour or 2 nights in.
Yeah.
But we have,
I kind of think that like 70s, 80s, you either had the vocal chops or you didn't, and you probably didn't have very much idea of what you were doing. Now, there were some singers who were classically trained, you know, and there were some who had amazing ranges. Jeff Tate, you know, in Queensryche is a great example. Rob Halford, obviously, you know. Even, I guess you could even say Dio. I mean, Dio was more of a powerful singer than anything else. Probably one of the most powerful voices in metal.
Something about Dio. I don't know if I brought this up. A friend of mine years ago was a part of a festival. My friend plays for a famous metal band, and he got to meet Dio. Of course, he's my age in this band.
Yeah.
He's a guitarist, but he sings too. And he said, oh, it's a pleasure to meet you. He said, Ronnie was so kind and sat down and took time. But one of the funny things was, so I sing a bit. What kind of warm-ups do you do? And Dio says, quite frankly, son, if you have to warm up, you don't got it.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like star athletes who had just raw talent who could get away with that. But then you look at, what's changed in sports in recent years, and people are like, well, you might actually be a stronger baseball player if you lift a few weights every once in a while. And now we have people like, knocking home runs out routinely. So I think you could say something like that happens. And you can say something like that happens with, so let me ask you about guitar, right? We have this proliferation of the ability to like see what people are doing on YouTube. If you
Right.
want to see somebody doing this particular solo, or like, you can hear J.K. Lee talking about like Bark at the Moon and how people often get the chord progression wrong, and here's what's actually happening. So having those things at your disposal and not having to like figure it out for yourself, it changes the learning curve significantly, right? And makes it possible for people to use technique rather than just relying on just unpredictable talent. Talent can always go away, right?
So here's the thing about YouTube. I've noticed a big problem with it is that people will go to YouTube, and well, first of all, before I go to that, we all know about the Instagram guitarist, right? The 30 seconds of shred.
I don't, because I'm not on Instagram. So tell me what that is.
It's people in their bedrooms that could play these ridiculous tricks in their bedroom. They put one up a day, and then they get a lot of followers because it's like, brrr, like I know when it comes to my feed because it's just this, but or they'll play something they saw on YouTube. The clickbait, the 10 secrets guitar teachers don't want you to know. And here's the problem with it. All these videos are robbing people of discovering their own voice or being able to play in a band. So it's like, oh, I just learned Bark at the Moon from J.K. Lee. I'm going to put that on Instagram. Oh, I got 2,000 likes. I'll do more of that instead of learning the actual value of music. Learning. So it's kind of like handing someone a paint by numbers book. One is green, and don't get it out of the lines. You all like this picture painting I did, rather than somebody getting a blank canvas.
Yeah.
So not that it's all bad, but I think.
Although in this case, it would be, you have to learn how to collaborate with other people on that same canvas, right? So it's more complex. If all you do is learn licks and let's call them licks and tricks, right? And various things, and you don't actually spend the hours and hours playing with other people, you're not going to develop in the same way.
Or you take these shredders and then you get them on one of these, and I'll say, play Happy Birthday. Don't make a mistake. And they should be musical enough to have ears, or I'll say, put your finger on any note, play Happy Birthday. And they mess it up. And I go, okay, so you're telling me that you're going like this every day, playing a million notes, but you can't play Happy Birthday because you're not. So being a musician, there's a difference between being a guitarist or a drummer or a singer and a musician. Those are not the same thing. Just because you play guitar doesn't mean you're a musician. Musician means you can speak the language of music to some degree. Right. So
it's broader, in other words, right? And it can interface with the others.
So on a serious sense, it's like if I get on a gig and there's a trio, a bass player starts a groove and I hear, okay, he's in the key of F. All right. So boom, boom. And then we're having a conversation, speaking. But if you get one of those people on, they'll do their 3 tricks and then the show's over.
Yeah.
And I don't want to, that's no disrespect to these people. I don't mean to put them down. I'm just saying it's launched a different way of playing it, and let's not confuse the YouTube
Yeah.
tricks and tricks for developing a musician or somebody that can function in a band or will have a music career.
Well, you know, I think that's kind of interesting. And we before we end, because we're a little bit over time, we'll take Emily's other question. But I'll say, I mentioned Rudolf Schenkner, and we can also talk about Steve Harris, and I think we can talk about Dio, and we can talk about Lemmy, as people who did exactly what you're talking about. They were musicians. Dio was a singer, but Dio could play every instrument. I've met people who actually worked with Dio, and they were surprised to see him just like walk over and pick up a guitar and say, "This is what I want you to play." You know?
Well, Dio could also walk up to Vivian and sing,
Yeah,
and expect Vivian to be musical enough to go, "Okay,
yeah.
you sang this."
So I think with these, like, well, let's call them super composers, you know, they're at the really high end of what you're talking about, where they, you know, whatever's going on in their brain, they can visualize the whole gamut of what's supposed to be happening. Steve Harris apparently is like that as well, you know. He plays the bass, but he runs Iron Maiden, you know.
Oh yeah, he hears it all. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it's very clear from Bruce Dickinson's autobiography that is the case. You know? You know, and we could probably point that out with others. Let's take, so Emily has a good question to go out on. Where should we situate forgotten bands? And I don't actually know that the best new wave of British heavy metal songs are written by Hatch, Salem, Bashful Alley, Bitches Sin, Mithra, Reincarnate. I've heard some of them. You know, Mithra's good. I wouldn't say Mithra is you know, Iron Maiden good. Maybe Saxon good. Or, you know, they're all doing different things. But this is a great question. Where should we situate these forgotten bands? I think that we can say that there was like almost like a top tier, and the top tier is the ones that got the most notoriety, and they were able to, you know, launch careers that would be well established forever. And so that includes Iron Maiden and you know, Def Leppard and Saxon. And then there's like a second tier of bands that, you know, still have to struggle, like Raven, Tank, you know, some of these other bands in there that are still around, maybe broke up, came back together. Diamond Head, I would say, what's left of them is in there. And then there's like the bands that people knew about, but most people don't know about. And so, you know, bring up Mithra, that's a great example. If you want to find their stuff, I think the only place you can actually find it is on YouTube. Because I think that's what I did, is I used the thing that allows you to like download the video and turn it into an MP3 to listen to them. Otherwise, I wouldn't have ever heard them. Maybe you can hear some of their stuff on Pandora. I haven't been on Pandora for a long time, but it's not going to come up much. So where would we situate them? They're stuck in a kind of limbo, you know, and it's really unfortunate. They will probably, other than, you know, people who are really into this particular movement of music, they're probably not going to get widely heard. And I don't know what we do to change that. And, you know, maybe Scott, you have an idea, or some of the other people here have some ideas about how we get people to be more aware of these bands. I mean, should we wear T-shirts of them, like Charlie on Always Sunny in Philadelphia does with Magnum? Right? Magnum kind of fits in there, right? They'd be in that tier where things just never came together. So Mark says an important step is archiving. That's a good point. You know, a lot of if this stuff is only available on YouTube or out there in records that people have in their basements, right, we're going to lose it, because sooner or later YouTube will take that stuff down. And so, you know, we probably have to figure out some way to preserve this stuff. And when stuff like Tank's Honor and Blood is not available in digital form anywhere that I can see, we've got some real problems, you know.
That's a business thing. I would, it's my guess. I mean, I don't know the specific situation. I mean, maybe they said nobody cares about us, so we're not going to put it out, you know, but my guess, but you know, to some degree, you know, being known or being on the top tier is not a meritocracy, you know, always. I mean, I wouldn't say that Iron Maiden doesn't deserve to be where they are. You know, let's say Iron Maiden was the third tier, I'd still be a huge fan, right? But I'd be seeing clubs at like small clubs in Boston, like the Paradise. But you know, there's a place for all of us, and it's not always fair. It's like, look at poor Bob Geldof, right? The Boomtown Rats. And then he puts on, he keeps failing, and then he puts on Live Aid by himself. And, that's his huge success, but he's always forgotten that poor guy, no matter what great music or what great record he puts out or what great cause he does, he just gets a slap in the face from the world. And he put a book out in the 80s called Is That It? And the book was basically like, what do I have to do? Essentially.
Yeah.
So I think, the fact that you bring up these bands means they're worth a lot more than the bands that stayed in the clubs that were really good, that they just died by 1987. And I saw a lot of them in Boston in the late 80s, early 90s that blew my mind. But then, it went to grunge and they were too late. And, and then they just disbanded and they got jobs, and there's no reunion. So I guess I don't want to say it's like nobody, what's the right word? The preserving thing is a good word. I like that. You preserve.
Archiving?
Archiving, because we're not going to push them to the top because, for some odd reason, it's like, we'll have our favorite band and like nobody's into it. Be like, this album's the best. When I was in school, nobody cared. And I wasn't going to make them care. There's nothing I could do to make them. I can make them listen to it. I remember playing my friend the new Pete Way album, Wasted, and he listened to 2 songs and shut my stereo off. He goes, "This is terrible," and left. And I was like, "This is cool, man," But what was I gonna do? Like take his head and throw it in the turntable? You listen to this album, like you can't make people on different tiers. But the archiving for the people that do care, I think is important. But I'd be curious. It'd be case by case by like if their hands are tied. Like if you were to reach out to them on Twitter, I'm sure.
A lot of these bands just they've broken up and they don't have any presence anymore. And I think, the stuff that's on YouTube is primarily because fans happen to have a Mithra album or a Legend album or something like that. And then they play it, and sometimes they record the entire album as a YouTube video. Sometimes they break it up into the tracks, and
right.
that's all that's available,
My advice is the one thing about social media, and I'm not great on Twitter. I don't do a lot. I am on Twitter, but I don't do much. It seems to be a great way to connect with these people. So let's say one of these bands you're really into, and you can say you can message them and you could say, hey, you're a great band. Where can I buy an album? Or
how could I support? Yeah.
And they might be really excited to hear from you and say, hey, we don't have an online store, but if you PayPal me $15, I'll mail it to you and thank you.
Yeah.
It's like they might have a stack of these records in the basement.
That's true. Yeah. So that's
what advice.
That's a good thing to end on, but there is also a good quip from Chris Morrissey. The medium is the mediocrity. That's what I was laughing about a little bit earlier. So. All right. Well, thanks, Scott, once again for joining us here. I always love being able to tap your expertise, especially on the technology and a lot of the music history that I don't myself know. And it's always good to get a musician's perspective as well, especially one who loves the genre. So thanks to everybody for joining us. And yeah, we went a little bit over time, so thanks for hanging out for the time. And